The workshop I did was on propaganda and censorship during World War II. And I thought it was particularly important to look at that because I think often when we think about World War II and propaganda, we think about fascism, we think about totalitarian countries. But the fact of the matter is that the United States actually developed a fairly sophisticated and you might even say a more effective propaganda effort than some of the fascist countries in Germany or Italy, for example. And so I always like to highlight that to students and focus both on censorship as well as propaganda techniques. And so so we talked in the workshop about the various ways that propaganda was utilized. In particularly, we talked about the fact that the emphasis of propaganda in the United States was supposed to be entertaining. It was not supposed to be boring. It was not supposed to be sticking out. And I think the radio propaganda in particular, I think, highlighted that very effectively. I think many Americans didn't even know that the propaganda was taking place. It was very ingeniously and effectively inserted into shows, and the whole industry was behind it. So you actually had writers, advertisers, stars participating very freely, and it became part of the common entertainment routine during the early 1940s in the United States. And so I think that's actually one of the secrets maybe of the propaganda in the United States, that it was in many ways less noticeable and flowed with the rest of the culture in a fairly seamless way. So that's one of the focus areas that we looked at. I think the same can be said for film propaganda that we highlighted. I think here sometimes the propaganda was a little more obvious. It was not as smoothly integrated always, but it certainly too made sure that it connected with, the cultural themes, the entertainment interests of the American public, and thereby flowed fairly smoothly again as part of the popular culture at the time. The other segment that I highlighted in the workshop was the censorship issue, and especially again the fact that censorship was widespread, and the most significant part of that was that the United States government obviously had a firm interest in portraying a sanitized war, a war that had not too many flaws, that was harmonious and ran fairly smoothly. So any incidents, for example, of friendly fire were never reported. The first dead American soldier actually was not shown in a photograph until the fall of 1943, which is pretty remarkable because by that time many Americans had died. It was a year and a half into the war. And yet I think it was in September of 1943 when Americans for the first time saw a dead American soldier in their magazines. And what's interesting about that too is the reason that the government actually loosened the strings on censorship at that point in time was that they felt that the American public was getting too complacent, that they needed to get reminded of the sacrifices that people were committing or willing to endure at the time. And so it was actually in the fall of 1943 that the government decided that they wanted to show dead American soldiers as a reminder to the general public that they too should do their part in this war. And that became more and more commonly the case in 1944, 1945. Again, trying to reinvigorate the war effort and trying to keep all Americans on the same page and engaged in this campaign. So I think, again, overall, I find it fascinating that these efforts, again, were quite effective. They were quite widespread, and had some very significant legacies as well. I think one of the most significant legacies probably is that the people who actually ran the propaganda campaigns for the United States during this time were the advertisers and the commercial broadcasters. And one of the things that they wanted to make sure was that the American capitalist enterprise was emphasized in these campaigns. And so they utilized the war in some ways also to not just unify the American public behind the war effort, but also unify the American public behind a capitalist democracy. And this became sort of an important subtext that ran through most of the specific campaigns at the time. The films obviously are widely available. It wouldn't be very difficult to find them. The same is true for radio broadcasts. They are on YouTube. You can actually find most of, or many of the old-time radio broadcasts. Obviously, the Library of Congress has many of them. In fact, that's where I did my research and procured most of them. I think probably the most important way to utilize the Library of Congress holdings would probably be in the visual propaganda, because they have both the images that were taken and at the time were censored by the government, as well as images that were taken and were released. And one of the interesting things, for example, a high school teacher could do would be to show students images that were censored and images that were released, pay close attention to the date when they were either censored or released, and ask students about why they think a particular picture or photograph was censored or released. I think that could be really interesting, especially also when you look at the issue of race during World War II. There was particular sensitivity around images that portrayed African American or other minority soldiers. And it's very apparent that the federal government was concerned about what the general public might think about, for example, black soldiers dancing with white women in Italy at an OSU event or something like that. So I think the images, again, the images especially that were censored, the images that were released when this was taking place, I think would be a very interesting exercise for students to engage in and to figure out why was this a problem or why was it not a problem.